I am Jessica Beagle, and I'm excited to be here with you today to unravel the often perplexing yet crucial topic of indirect cost rates. As someone who has spent many years navigating the ins and outs of school finance, I know that indirect cost rates can be sometimes feeling like the fine print in our budgets, important but not always clear. My goal today is to demystify indirect costs and show you how to turn these often overlooked elements into powerful tools for your district's financial health. Let's get started and make the invisible visible. Here are today's topics. My hope for you is to minimally gain a basic overview of what the rates are, how they're used, how they're calculated, and the district's role in generating these rates. Let's start with breaking down what an indirect cost rate really is. Think of it as a percentage that helps us allocate expenses that benefit multiple projects or activities. But these expenses are not always easy to pin down to just one activity. These are the kinds of costs that are essential for keeping an organization running smoothly, but they do not always directly tie to a specific project. So, for example, think about the rent for office space or the utilities that we all rely on, administrative salaries, and the office supplies that we use every day. These are common indirect costs, and since they benefit the whole organization or several projects at once, we need a way to fairly distribute these expenses. That's where indirect cost rates come in. It helps us to spread those sheer costs across different projects. By using an indirect cost rate, we ensure that our budgeting, our grant management, and our service pricing reflect all of our costs accurately and fairly. In Michigan, it's important to note that unless the law specifically states otherwise, indirect cost rates are only developed for use with federal funds. So let's talk about the four types of rates. These rates are all calculated by the department using FID data. So don't worry, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to do any of the heavy lifting. In fact, while some states require their districts to handle all of the calculations and then submit them for approval, here in Michigan, we take care of most of that for you. All we need from you is a little bit of input on your end. Each of these rates has a specific purpose. And as I mentioned earlier, indirect cost rates are generally established for the use on federal grants, with one exception. And we'll start with this exception, the special education rate, which is developed specifically for the state of Michigan special education grants. According to Section 51A, MCL 388.1651A, which covers the allocations for reimbursements to districts and intermediate districts for special education programs and services in personnel, indirect costs are allowed. This is actually the only section of state school aid that permits indirect costs. You can find the special education rate posted on our website every April. We provide two reports, one that shows the calculation by district and another that presents the weighted average calculation by ISD. Now, this ISD rate is a weighted average based on data submitted in the FID by the ISD's constituent districts. Essentially, the district data submitted rolls up to the ISD rates. This is good news, as no additional input is required from districts for this rate. We published this rate in April, and it is capped at 15%. Generally, grants awarded by the U.S. Department of Education allow for the use of the restricted cost rate. We'll start with this restricted rate and what restricted really means. We've already discussed that the indirect cost rate is essentially a ratio of indirect costs divided by direct costs. The number of this restricted ratio includes costs that benefit all programs, but it can't be specifically or readily identified with any one particular program. However, there are additional restrictions placed on these costs. For example, costs associated with the operations and maintenance of the organization cannot be included in the numerator, and additionally, costs related to the chief executive officer or the CEO's component units, what we refer to in Michigan as the head of component, are also excluded. When it comes to reporting the head of component, this is required only if a district's membership exceeds 2,999, which I will discuss next. It's important to note that federal funds are awarded by the U.S. Department of Education and cannot be used to supplant non-federal funds. In other words, these funds are meant to supplement, not replace, state and local funding. And finally, the restricted rates are also capped at 15%. As I mentioned earlier, the head of component, meaning the chief executive officer and their component units, cannot be included in the numerator of the restricted rate. And unfortunately, this does require a manual adjustment, which involves the district reporting their head of component on the DS 4513 form. This is the form that we use to make adjustments to the rates, and districts are required to submit this form if they are considered to need that information for the head of component. So what exactly is a component? A component is an organizational unit that benefits the entire school district. Think of roles like the superintendent, the business officer, or finance manager, or the CFO. On an organizational chart, these CEOs are typically one level below the superintendent, though for larger districts, they may also be two levels below the superintendent. They often hold titles like assistant superintendent, deputy superintendent, chief financial officer, or human resource executive or director. The head of components unit might also include immediate employees who serve as the executive or administrative assistants to these CEOs. Reporting the head of component is relatively a new requirement starting in 2018. Districts are required to report this if they have more than 2,999 students in a given year. And I realize this may not apply to everyone, so I won't dwell on it too much more, but it's good to know because even if your district hasn't qualified in the past, you might qualify in the future. The department makes this determination, and if your district has more than 2,999 students or membership, we look at your status report, you'll be contacted starting in April. For districts that meet the head of component threshold, you're minimally required to submit the Part 4 HOC tab of the DS 4513 form along with an org chart. Without this, your district will receive a zero indirect cost rate. You cannot accept the rate as is. These submissions are required for us to calculate your rates accurately. I do send out emails to districts that require head of component information as well as reminders. I'm still working on the right amount of contact so as not to be too annoying, but also to keep those forms coming in so the process can be completed. This is also why it's important for all districts to keep their business manager contact information up to date in the EEM. This is where I pull that contact information from, in addition to looking at whoever submitted last year's information. And other communications regarding indirect cost rates will come from here, as well as some information regarding shared time programs. So if you're a business manager or an administrator for your district, please make sure that those are updated in the EEM, and we suggest checking them annually, likely as the new fiscal year begins is a good time. Unrestricted rates come into play for programs that do not require a restricted rate. For example, USDA programs use this unrestricted rate. These rates are designed for programs where there aren't specific limitations on indirect costs. Unlike the restricted rate, when we calculate the unrestricted rate, we include expenditures for the chief executive officer as well as operations and maintenance in the indirect costs. Everything else is classified the same way as the restricted rate calculations. And just like the restricted rate, the unrestricted rate is also capped at 15%. The Medicaid indirect rates were specifically developed for use with Medicaid school-based services. These rates are pretty similar to the unrestricted indirect cost rate, as they also include the costs related to operations and maintenance and the chief executive officer. The main difference, though, is that the Medicaid rate, it has a higher cap. It's capped at 25% compared to the 15% cap on the unrestricted rate. So all costs are categorized the same. The only difference is that 25%, which then affects the carry forward adjustment in the calculation, which we kind of talk about a bit later. I touched on what an indirect cost is in the beginning, but just to reiterate, what exactly is an indirect cost? Simply put, indirect costs are those expenses that aren't easily tied to a specific project or activity. Think of them as costs that benefit multiple projects or activities within the organization. But it would be too time consuming or costly to assign these to just one project or activity. And like we said earlier, the examples include administrative costs like salaries, auditing, budgeting, accounting, payroll, HR, purchasing, and employee relations. These are all typical examples of indirect costs. They're essential, but they support the overall functioning of the organization rather than just one specific project. So now let's talk about the direct costs. According to the Code of Federal Regulations, direct costs are expenses that can be specifically linked to a particular project or cost activity. These are costs that you can directly charge to grants, to contracts, or other programs. So what does that look like in practice? Well, typical direct costs might include things like salaries for employees who spend their time working on a specific program, the cost of materials that are purchased, used, or consumed specifically for that program, or travel expenses that are necessary to carry out the work of that program. These are the kinds of costs that clearly and directly tie to the activities that they support. And so then, how are these rates calculated? It might sound straightforward at first, but in reality, it's often a bit more complex. We start with the FID. We use the district's FID data for our calculations. These costs are then sorted into categories, which you can find on the report RO 418A on the MDE website. You want to know how these costs are categorized for each rate? Believe it or not, it's right on our website as well. If you check out the Appendix A of the indirect cost rate plan on our webpage, it breaks down expenditures into indirect, direct, or unallowable, and excluded costs. Some objects within certain functions get special treatments, which is also explained in the appendix. When you look at the Form RO418A on the website, you'll see a summary of the district's financial data from the previous year. Remember, we're always working with the most recently submitted FID data, and that will come from your previous year. This data forms the basis for the next year's preliminary indirect rates. In a nutshell, it's all about organizing last year's financial data to set up next year's rates. Let's take a look at Form RO418A. It's very fascinating, I promise. This report shows total expenditures by function, and then it sorts it into different buckets. So you have your total expense, exclusions, direct or unallowable, and then because we have different costs in your indirect for unrestricted and your indirect for restricted, those two are separated, so they are distinctly identified. And this sorting is based on how those expenses are recorded in the FID. So here's the thing. These classifications aren't always perfect. Sometimes they might need a bit of tweaking, especially if your district records expenditures outside of the guidance set forth in the accounting manual. This is where we may need the district to manually adjust or reclassify expenditures. Don't get too antsy about this because it doesn't happen often, but I do know that there are districts that often need additional ways to record information so it suits the district and they have that information readily at hand. And that doesn't always align with our accounting structure. So we need to think about that when we're looking at these costs. Think of it kind of like sorting your laundry. Most of the time it's straightforward, but occasionally you find a red sock in with the whites and it needs to move. Now, let's check out the form RO418, and this is where the magic happens. This report shows how we actually calculate the indirect cost rates using the expenses we just saw categorized on the RO418A. We use what's called a fixed with carry forward indirect cost rate. Sounds fancy, right? But here's what it means. We're basically comparing estimated future costs with actual past costs. When the real numbers come in, we make an adjustment to reconcile the difference. We call this the carry forward adjustment. And it happens in the next period when we have your actual costs. So let's look at the example. Say we're figuring the rate for the 24-25 school year. Since that hasn't happened yet, we don't have real costs to work with. So we make our best guess and we use projected costs to calculate the rate. Think of it like planning a budget for next month based on what you spent last month and then adjusting once you see what you actually spent. So now we're going to talk about something that might seem tedious, but is actually crucial to the process, and that's accurate financial reporting. I've been in your shoes, working in a district business office. I know the accounting structure can be rigid, and I know that FID reporting often feels like just another task on the long to-do list, especially when it comes towards the end of the year and you have year-end stuff going on and you're trying to close out and your audit's coming up. I get it. I understand. I've been in your shoes. But here's why it matters. First, accurate indirect cost calculations. Second, it's better support for your district. Third, it helps us help you without adding to your workload. When you follow the accounting guidance, you're not just doing it because we say so. You're giving us the tools to support you effectively, especially when unexpected funds come your way. Think of it like keeping your needs organized for tax season. A bit of effort now can save you lots of headaches later. Let me give you two real-world examples on how good data makes a difference. COVID relief funds. This sudden, this sudden influx could have tanked many districts' indirect rates. But with accurate data, we were able to spread the impact over several years. We softened the blow without having to ask you to do extra work. Next, we have the MIPSR's one-time payment that came through this past year. We aim to do the same thing here, but we hit some snags. Districts were advised to use grant code 263 for the MIPSR's one-time payment. Some districts didn't use the grant code 263, and in other cases where districts did use the grant code 263, they reported amount that was different than what they received when submitting the FID. So here's the thing. When data isn't recorded accurately, it ties our hands. We want to help you manage these unexpected funds, but we can only do that if the numbers are right. And the bottom line is, accurate reporting isn't just busy work. It's how we work together to navigate financial challenges and make the most of new funding opportunities. So for a minute, let's revisit Michigan's fixed with carry forward rate. So we know it's based on estimates of future operations and costs. We adjust for differences between the estimates and actuals in later periods. Normally, good forecasting means small adjustments, but here's the twist. COVID relief funds threw a wrench in the works. We had much higher costs than anticipated. The result? A bigger gap between estimates and actuals. So what does that mean for you? Well, for some districts, it meant a larger carry forward adjustment, which means significant decreases in subsequent calculated rates, and some districts would have seen much lower or even negative rates. So the bottom line, the decrease could have made it tough for LEAs to handle necessary administrative tasks. Think of it like budgeting for a typical year. Then suddenly your furnace quits working. You didn't plan accordingly with a home repair category in your budget, and now your estimates are off, and next year's budget needs major adjustments. But don't worry. Excuse me, don't worry. There's a strategy in place to help you manage these fluctuations. And this brings us to the concept of smoothing. Smoothing is our way of spreading the over recovery over the next 2-year cycles. And there's even year cycles and there's odd year cycles. This is particularly important for districts that would have otherwise faced drastic decreases in their indirect cost rates. By doing this, we minimize the immediate impact of the influx of funds on indirect rates, making the transition smoother and more manageable. How do we determine which districts receive smoothing? Well, for each district, we look at each rate individually, the restricted rate, unrestricted rate, and Medicaid rate. We first look at the districts that use their rates in the 21-22 year based on the most recent FID data. Next, we consider two factors. We look for a significant decrease. In this example, when we calculated the 22-23 rates, we then checked if the 22-23 rates decreased by 50% or more from the 21-22 rates. For example, if a district had 7.5% rate in the 21-22 year and it dropped to 1.96 in 22-23, that is a 74.14% decrease. This district would have had their 22-23 rates smoothed by spreading the over recovery over the next 2 even cycles. So these districts' rates will see the smoothing effects in 22-23 and also in 24-25 and 26-27. We next looked to see if there was a moderate decrease. So if the district didn't meet the 50% or more decrease criterion, we then looked at those with a rate decrease of 5 percentage points or more from 21-22 to 22-23. For instance, if a district's rate went from 13.92% last year to 7.71% this year, that's a 6.21 percentage point decrease, meeting this criterion. So often these two criteria overlapped, but some districts were captured by one or the other. For a list of districts that were impacted in these years by the smoothing calculation, you can find a link on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. And here is just an example of how the smoothing was applied to each rate. Important to note again that not every district was affected by smoothing and saw adjustments, and not every district that was affected by smoothing saw adjustments across all rates. It could have been one rate, it could have been two rates, it could have been all three rates. But each rate was carefully reviewed individually. If you look at the example, take a look at the over recovery before the smoothing adjustment. At the very bottom, you can also see the rate as it stood before the smoothing. The darker over recovery line represents the adjusted over recovery after smoothing. It's 1/3 of the original over recovery. This adjustment figure is what's then used to calculate the rate for this 23-24 year, which you'll find at the bottom of the calculation. You can see here how the restricted rate increased from 2.11% before the smoothing to 4.29% after smoothing. Now let me walk you through how the smoothing process will impact the next few cycles, just so you have a visual here. Starting with our previous example, you'll remember that the original over recovery amount for the restricted rate was $661,281.10. Since we're spreading this over recovery across 3 cycles, we divide that amount by 3 to determine this year's portion of the over recovery. Then we take the remaining 2/3 and allocate them to the next 2 even year cycles as the smoothing adjustment. So for the 23-24 year, the over recovery is $220,427.03. The remaining $440,000 will be spread over the next 2 even year cycles, meaning we'll add that $220,000 to both the 25-26 and the 27-28 over or under recovery amounts from those calculations. This approach helps us distribute the impact of the over recovery that occurred due to the additional coronavirus relief funds more evenly across multiple cycles. In the previous slide, we saw that the smoothing adjustments are carried forward over the next 2 even cycles, specifically for the most recent rates affecting the 23-24 school year. These adjustments are then applied to the 25-26 and 27 school years. We followed this same approach in 22-23. Those adjustments are being carried forward to the next 2 odd cycles, 24-25 and 26-27 school years. And that should be the end of the smoothing. So let's talk about what your district needs to do. What is expected of your district for the indirect cost rate process? It's not mandatory to adjust your preliminary information. You should be reviewing your preliminary information for accuracy, especially if you're relying on these rates. I can't tell you the number of times I've worked with a district only to discover that for whatever reason, the coding didn't translate properly into the FID. So be sure to use Form RO418A that we talked about earlier to confirm that all of your costs are categorized correctly. Next, you'll want to determine if any reclassifications or exclusions are needed and make those adjustments where necessary. Since our time is limited today, I won't dive into all of those details, but I want you to know that I am here to help you whenever you need it. We also have a document available on our website that explains reclassifications and exclusions. Just look for the indirect cost rate plan near the top of the page. I do try to provide as much information out there for you as possible to help you if you're uncomfortable reaching out to me or we haven't been able to connect yet. There is a ton of information out there. It's just maybe navigating it a little bit challenging, and I'm working on that for you as well. So step 3 is all about reviewing the video tutorials. Like I said, there's multiple resources on the Indirect website. So if you're filling out the DS4513 form, which districts use to submit their adjustments, or if you just need a quick refresher on what goes where, these videos can be helpful. They're on YouTube, so you can speed them up, jump straight to a part you need, or watch the whole thing at your own pace. And make sure to download the latest version of the form from our website because I do update it every year and I tweak it to make things easier for both you and for us in the processing. So during our review, things can go quickly and smoothly. Here's a tip now from my 8 years of running this process. I highly recommend that everyone take a close look at the subcontracts tab. If you do nothing else, unless you're a head of component district, do look at the contracts tab. Many districts contract out their services, and anything over $25,000 of a contract should be excluded. That also means that you should only be charging indirect on the first $25,000 of any contract charged to a grant. There's more information on this $25,000 rule on our website. There is a link dedicated just to that. And just so you know, focusing on this one piece can really help improve your rates. This is one piece of information that we are unable to glean from your FID data, which is why it requires input from you. But also know that it does help your rates when you complete this part. When you're done with your form, you will submit it through our online portal. It's a straightforward fillable form online where you just upload your DS4513. If you're head of component district, you'll also upload an org chart. This is the only way that we accept submissions now. No more email or fax. Using this online portal streamlines everything, and it's helped us track and process submissions more efficiently and accurately. It seems to go without saying that federal grants do require administrative effort, from the application process to compliance and reporting, financial management, monitoring and evaluating, as well as training. The amount of administrative load is very much undervalued. Make sure that you're using your rates. Do keep in mind that rates change every year on July 1, and now you know exactly where to find them, right on our website. We've talked about what the rate is, what direct and indirect costs are, how they're categorized, how the rate is calculated, and what you as the district should be doing to participate in that process. Let us now discuss how the indirect cost rate works in practice. Imagine you receive a $100,000 grant with a 5% indirect cost rate. Sounds great, does it not? But now, how does one actually use that rate? Here's the important part. We simply do not take the 5% of the total grant amount. Instead, we apply the 5% to program costs. In this case, you'd be able to charge up to $4,762 for indirect costs, leaving $95,238 for your actual program. That adds up to your total $100,000 grant amount. Now you might be thinking, wow, that math worked out perfectly. But let me assure you, and I'm sure you already know, it's not always that clean in the real world. The important thing to remember is the basic idea. With a 5% rate, you can charge 5% of your program costs until you have exhausted your grant funds. The key point I would like to emphasize here is that, again, the amount of indirect costs you can recover is not based on your total award amount. We do not simply multiply your rate by the full 100,000 grant. Instead, the rate applies to what you've actually spent and charged to the grant. It's all about the real expenses, not just the numbers on the paper. For grants that span multiple years, it's important to use the indirect rate that applies to the period when the expenditure actually occurred. So if you're spending funds in year 2 of your grant, you need to use the indirect rate for year 2, not the indirect rate for year 1 or 3. This may not be new information, but it seems to be coming up a lot recently, so it's crucial for making sure that your calculations are accurate. A common mistake I've seen is applying the rate from the final year of the grant to the expenditures that occurred in year 1. This also ties into when you draw down on indirect, which I'll talk about here momentarily. It's worth double checking to make sure you're using the correct rate for the specific time period. Doing this will help avoid potential issues during audits and keep your rates from significant fluctuations. Let's walk through an example of a grant that spans multiple years. Again, the indirect rates are good for 1 year, aligned with the fiscal year, July 1 to July 30. So you'll want to be mindful of which rate you're using based on when the expenditure actually happened. In this example, the first expense was incurred on June 15th, close to the end of the fiscal year. So according to our chart here, the district would apply the 10% rate that was in effect at that time. The next expense occurred on July 15th, which is in the next fiscal year. And so they would then apply the 8% rate for that period. So you've got 2 fiscal years, expenses occurring in different fiscal years. Use the rate that applies for that fiscal year when the expense occurred. One last thing to keep in mind. You can absolutely draw down your indirect costs periodically, whether it's monthly, quarterly, or even annually. However, I really want to stress that you should be claiming your indirect costs at least annually by the end of each fiscal year. Don't wait until year 3 of your grant to charge all of your expenses and do one single drawdown. You cannot claim indirect until you've charged expenses to the grant. So if you wait until the 3rd year of a 3-year grant to draw down all of your indirect costs, meaning you've charged 0 expenditures and recorded 0 indirect for years 1 and 2, it's going to throw off your rates, and it could cause some issues down the line. Keeping it regular helps maintain accuracy and keeps things running smoothly. So oftentimes I've heard districts want to go back and claim indirect for year 1 in year 2 or 3, and they didn't do so, and you may not be able to. The grant system may not let you. But if you're doing that, know that you're recording indirect in a year when it actually wasn't applied for that year, and it's throwing what you record into your FID off, and it's going to skew those rates when we go to calculate them later on. You're going to have zero indirect recovery in one year and an entire grant's worth of recovery in another year. That's going to throw off your rates because of when you're claiming your expenditures. Finally, understanding how costs are classified and how rates are calculated is really just the beginning. There is importance in using your rates as well. Accounting for the recovery of your indirect costs is the next piece of the puzzle, and its importance was discussed earlier. We have a document available on the indirect cost webpage that explains how to account for the recovery of indirect costs. In a nutshell, when accounting for these recoveries, you'll use the function that begins with 6. This allows your district to bill the grant without impacting your actual cost data. This is also how we verify that a district is actually applying their indirect cost rate. And by checking this function, and we also check the object code 9990. This is what helped us do the smoothing and determine who was using their rates. If it was determined that districts didn't appear to be using their rates, we didn't look at smoothing for those districts because it just would have taken a lot of effort for districts who don't appear to be using their rates at all. And that is where we wrap it up for today, folks. I have provided a number of resources here. They're all beneficial. Everything can be found on the state aid webpage or from there. It's michigan.gov/SASF, Sam Adams, Sam Frank. Or I have linked to the indirect page here. Feel free to bookmark it and be sure to check it each year for the updated forms and rates. But again, everything can be found from the state school aid webpage. You can find the accounting manual from there. There's a link to it from there. You can find status reports. You can find the school aid updates. You can links to the indirect cost webpage. So please be sure to check that out and bookmark it if possible. Our next cycle begins April 20th. Preliminary rates will be posted then. Adjustments using the DS 4513 form will be accepted from April 20th to June 1st. Late submissions, and I cannot stress this enough, late submissions are not accepted. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that has to happen between June 1 and June 20 when the final rates are published on the website. And those rates also have to be shared with internal folks like the grants team, the Office of Special Education, and CEPI. So I cannot accept late submissions because it causes a chain reaction of delays that we just cannot have. And finally, my email address. I can be reached by email most of the time. Please understand that during the indirect season, it is very busy, but I promise I will get back to you. If you ever want to chat, we can set up a time to talk. I can absolutely work with you and walk you through the steps, show you the form, help you understand what it's used for. And anytime you can also reach out to my supervisor, Phil Boone. He actually passed on this process to me, so his knowledge is invaluable. And I often collaborate with him to make sure that I'm understanding things correctly. So he is definitely a resource should you not be able to get me or if you're more comfortable reaching out to him. I appreciate your time today, folks. Thank you so much. Take care and enjoy the rest of the conference.